What frames the creation of a text? And what does it mean for me to make this video from the comfort of my bedroom? In a leaky basement by candlelight.
Or out here in the snow of Toronto.
Just as setting frames how you engage with the words I speak, so too do ideologies surrounding socio-economic context frame a text creation. Frederick Jameson writes that we must face the problem of ideology as it shapes the very fantasy structures which allow the novel itself to be produced. This becomes even more important in our analysis of supposedly realist texts. As Díaz Lage wrote, naturalism relies for its portrait of society upon a map, which is itself a naturalized, indirect, reflection on the division of labor. In doing so, it turns its back on the sum total of forces which shape society, its ideologies, contradictions, and struggles. George Gissing's 1891 novel New Grub Street has often been approached in scholarship as an accurate, privileged, or realist look into the publishing world of the late Victorian era. But what happens when we begin to look at this realist text through external material documents and begin to analyze not only the ideological reality the text naturalizes, but the socio-economic factors surrounding the creation of the text's reality? Through an exploration of paratexts surrounding George Gissing's New Grub Street, my presentation today will explore how paratexts provide unique insights into the intentions and ideologies of those who write them. However, by pushing beyond authorial intention to the socio-economic context from which a text is produced, I will show how an analysis of paratext must be viewed through a Marxist framework of class identification and categorization to see not only how the ideology of a writer consciously enters a text, but how unconscious ideological conditions frame a text. In New Grub Street, reviews play a central role in the framing of public opinion. By reading a review, a text is framed for us in a certain light, through the lens of the reviewers themselves. But reviews also play a role in constituting and addressing a specific imagined audience that is informed by an ideological understanding of who the book is for and who is likely to read it. Barbara Leckie's essay, A Preface is Written to the Public, provides a framework through which we can approach the significance of reviews in the context of New Grub Street. Studying the late Victorian period, Leckie says that she is interested in the ways in which prefaces worked to redefine prevailing definitions of the reading public at a time when the reading public was perceived to be dominated by mass readers whose tastes were increasingly difficult either to identify or control. Leckie discusses how prefaces in the 1880s were used to confront issues of censorship. In 1868, the Hecklen Standard defined the test of obscenity as a work that may deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences, and in whose hands a publication of this sort might fall. In this law, authorial intention was excluded, and legal blame was centered around a qualitative corruption of an imagined reader that could encounter a text. The imagined reader was conceptualized as a young female reader, a socially and culturally informed embodiment of innocence. Many writers challenged the standardized imagining of a specific reading audience. The preface became an avenue, then, of challenging ideas of imagined readership by directly addressing the text readers before they began the work itself. Prefaces became grounds for the ideological informed address of imagined readers, who may in fact bear no resemblance to the actual reading audience of a text. Leckie's study of paratexts help us begin to think about how imagined reading audiences are framed through an ideological lens, and how these paratexts may influence one's engagement with the novel itself. It's impossible to fully address everyone equally who may be reading a text. Paratexts allow for us to gain insight into the ideological constructions of their writer and the addressee of their texts. Most importantly, who they include, disclude, or even how they treat or frame expectations of a demographic whom they're writing to. Reviews vary from Barbara Leckie's idea of the paratext as the material added by the writer, publisher, editor of a text. Criticism still frames a text, and in doing so works to fabricate and address an imagined audience in a similar way as prefaces. In New Grub Street, reviews play an important role in framing late Victorian conceptions of the reading masses that carry numerous ideological connotations and insights. Throughout New Grub Street, in the changing world of mass publishing, those in the industry attempt to target the widest possible audience to ensure their books and articles succeed. Jasper is a character who is particularly ruthless in this way, claiming that writing is a business. I maintain that we people of brains are justified in supplying the mob with the food it likes. The conceptions of the reading masses presented by those working in publishing is built around a similar elitist framework, positioning the educated and finer people against a vulgar, uneducated, or quarter-educated masses. An example of this plays out in the treatment of Harold Biffin's novel in New Grub Street. Jasper, Whelpdale, Mrs. Reardon, and others thoroughly enjoy Biffin's book. Whelpdale says he knows men who consider it an undoubted work of genius. Though Jasper does write two mostly favorable reviews, he tones down one to not seem overly boastful. Though he enjoyed the novel, his views of an imagined reading audience taint his perception of how the book will be received, despite an appreciation of the novel by those who identify as educated and of fine taste. Jasper still believes that most people will fling the book down with yawns before they're half through the first volume. Jasper reinforces the message that Gissing places throughout the book by depicting the reading masses as quarter-educated, vulgar, and mob-like. In the end, Gissing portrays Jasper's opinion as accurate. Biffin's book has no success. Gissing writes, reviewers in general were either angry or coldly contemptuous. However, when we look at reviews through the paratextual framing of Lage, and with intention to ideological framing and elitist biases, we see that perhaps these reviews are not acting in good faith themselves. Gissing frames Jasper as being of the new world of publishing, part of the new Grub Street. These reviewers are shown to mirror Jasper's opinions about what the reading masses would fancy, as Jasper's methodological approach to the publishing industry is met with success at the end of the novel. The reviews themselves are layered in a particular socio-economic way of knowing that may be out of touch with the reality of lower-class, quarter-educated individuals. As Lage writes in the period Gissing places and writes the novel in, the tastes of the reading public were increasingly difficult either fully to identify or control, in no way homogeneous as those in the publishing industry of New Grub Street see them. By assuming a particular taste homogenously over potential readers, these reviews preconceive a particular response from the reader, who has yet to encounter the book. The review then is sent out and read by individuals in the reading community who read that book, that the book is no good and don't bother to read it, thus constituting the failure of the text. But what did George Gissing intend with this aspect of the novel? Did he see the biased framing his text explored, or did he view the critics as genuine, honest individuals and their generalizations about the reading masses as accurate? Moving from the text itself, we can turn to the individual who authored it and explore their own ideological persuasions and constructions by analyzing primary source material written by the author about their text. For this, I would like to refer to two texts, both written by Gissing, that were brought to my attention through Michael Colley's essay that give insight into Gissing's intentionality behind the novel. In his essay, Gissing's Revisions of New Grub Street, Michael Colley calls attention to a series of letters written by Gissing that discuss his thoughts about New Grub Street and the circumstances surrounding its writing. In the autumn 1890, Gissing wrote the large three-decker novel New Grub Street. Over the course of 2 months, a breakneck pace which is reflected in Colley's description of the book as a leisurely book whose lack of momentum is the result of repetitiveness, unnecessary incidents, and a large amount of superfluous dialogue. Gissing was obliged to write a book for the winter for financial reasons and to help expedite his marriage to his second wife, Edith Underwood. The writing of the text was not a happy one for Gissing, with Gissing having been suffering from debilitating fits of loneliness and despair. Upon finishing the book, Gissing remarks to a friend that New Grub Street is dull and unhappy. The wonder is that I succeeded in writing any book at all during these weeks of utmost misery. Gissing had taught himself to write a three-decker book at great speed, a rush job, performed less out of joy and more out of financial need. The subject matter of New Grub Street is not surprising then. Gissing's own frustration, lack of finances, and struggle of interpersonal relationships are felt throughout the story in the narrative of Edwin Reardon. The struggling author who racks his brain, unable to write a novel due to his fears of criticism and a paralyzing responsibility for those around him, such as his wife Amy and their son. But the character of Edwin is beat down at every corner. Despite our getting a privileged view into his emotional states and thoughts throughout the novel, his stubbornness leads to his demise. With the framing of Gissing's letters, we can perhaps view the novel as tortured lashing out, a frustration with the state of the publishing world of Gissing's era, and the deaths of Biffin and Reardon as a symbolic suicide for Gissing of the true artist. But when we explore another source from Gissing, this image is complicated. Again, looking at Colley's work, he explores revisions made to the texts of New Grub Street by the author for a French translation of the novel in 1898. For this version, Gissing engaged in a hack-and-slash form of revision, cutting 110 pages from the original and adding nothing. By analyzing these cuts, as Colley does, the revised text gives a unique sense of Gissing's views on the novel, at least in 1898, which were not limited by the three-decker format, the French translation was a single volume, and the initial 2-month rush. In this revision, the novel focuses less on the intricacies of the publishing industry, and focuses more on the novel's portrayal of domestic drama, perhaps again connecting to Gissing's own surroundings in 1898, now married with 2 kids and living in Exeter. One of the most interesting changes of the French revision is Gissing's treatment of Reardon. Though the letters and biographical details frame Reardon as a character resembling Gissing, in the revision, the character is treated much more harshly, with far more disciplined attitude. Moments from the original text creating sympathy and emotional attachment to Reardon are removed, and the character is more apparently treated as someone who needs to get over himself and get to work, change with the times, and be happy about it. So how do we reconcile the at times contradictory purpose of Reardon in Gissing's mind? We cannot rely on one individual's perception of a text, whether it be a critic or the author themselves. Therefore, we must put the text in a larger context to understand not only the ideology framed in the text, but the ideology that goes into the framing. In an analysis of Gissing's early novels, Frederick Jameson places Gissing's work in a socio-economic context, looking at how material factors and statuses frame the ideological constructions of the author from whom the text emerges. Jameson writes that in a realist novel, the writer always hides themselves in the text by disguising social raw materials under the appearance of metaphysics and ethics, thus allowing us to analyze the ideological structure through which an individual organizes the world around them. Jameson describes Gissing's life and works as emerging from a conflict of class identification. Gissing was never overly successful, just eking out a living with his writing. Jameson positions Gissing as being unable to identify wholeheartedly with an urban proletariat, due in part to his education, but also his borderline bourgeois existence. Nor is Gissing able to engage fully with the snobbery of the Tory values of the wealthy elites. So for Jameson, Gissing's divided self remains a scandal for both classes, and the narratives generated by the structural instability of his class position provide a more vivid, a more permanently uncomfortable sense of class conflict. Applying this class-centered focus into the novel allows us to see the conflicting portrayals of class in the novel can be explained by Gissing's own inability to formulate a sense of class identification, able to depict and perhaps understand the struggles of impoverished individuals, but unable to transcend a strict sense of justified bourgeois hegemony and social order and elitism. Gissing's own socio-economic position enters and frames the reality of his realist novel, informing and warping it beyond its own conscious intentions. By the following Lecky's insights on paratexts, we can identify how ideologically informed material outside a novel actively influences our relationship to a novel. Mobilizing Lecky's practices allow us to frame Gissing's intentions behind New Grub Street through an analysis of his letters, biographical details, and the revised text. But it is only when we take these discoveries and apply them to a larger socio-economic context through the Marxist analysis of Frederick Jameson that we begin to see the ideological blind spots of a text and begin to understand how ideology permeates a text in ways beyond authorial intention. In the end, materials surrounding a text can provide and does provide helpful insights into intentionality. Why was a text written? For who? With what ideological assumptions about the world? But these texts must be placed in a larger ideological context to understand not how socioeconomics is framed in a text by the author, but how socioeconomic contexts actively frame a text. Thanks for watching.